Chaudhry. I am the program coordinator for the Power Center in New York City, which is a multi-service center for survivors of commercial sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. I also spearhead the communications for New Yorkers for the Equality Model, and so I will be moderating today's panel discussion today. Thank you for being here with us to watch this exclusive screening of Sell by Day with Sarah Jones, who's with us today for the panel discussion. Three amazing survivor leaders, one of whom was in the film and co-produced with Sarah.
Esperanza Fonseca, co-producer, who's so honored to have her expertise and guidance throughout this process.
And I just wanted to see if anyone else wanted to do a quick introduction of themselves before I begin.
Melanie.
Oh, I was like,
no
who's
pressure.
shouting that?
It's me.
Hi guys, my name is Melanie Thompson. I am the Outreach and Advocacy Coordinator at the Coalition Against Trafficking Women, and I'm also a survivor of domestic sex trafficking here in New York.
Good evening, everyone. And I'm a huge fan of Melanie, so just want to say that. My name is Gabrielle Priazzo. Everyone calls me Gigi. I am the Senior Peer Care Navigator at the Empower Center with Sanctuaries for Families.
And I just want to briefly say, just from the creative side, again, I keep saying this, but I've had conversations with Melanie, I've had conversations with Esperanza, but this, what you see here, they're co-writers, they're not credited, but I'm so very grateful for your, kind of support of this approach to trying to talk about this. And I want to say, we just got extended, which is virtually a miracle in a climate like this. So please, if you enjoyed this film and if you want to hear this conversation, kind of keep growing, please send all your people. We'll be here at least until November 3rd, and we're going to be streaming soon. And this is my dream, is that we get to have this conversation. Hopefully, I guess I want to say this and then give over to the real experts on this panel. This conversation and this particular, and I want to acknowledge my colleague Shannon O'Malley, who's in the audience, who is our Sell by Date impact visionary, and we have a chance to have a conversation. I'll just tell you, I have a lot of friends who are very clear on feminism and all the other issues they care about, and on this one issue, they are like, sex work or die. Like, it's really important to know that this conversation can happen in a way that, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I believe the hovercraft approach that I've been taking in this film is a way forward into a conversation that then gets folks to listen at a deeper level without knee-jerk, this is what I saw on Instagram, this is what feminists want me to say, and so this is what I'm saying, sex work is the right thing to say. Da, da, da. Again, you're gonna hear me in the press, saying I don't take a position on this, and I do that so that we can have more open dialogue. It's very important to me that I'm not only preaching to the choir with this. I feel like there's an opportunity here. So, all of this to say, please send all your people. We'll be streaming starting November 8th, but I hope we can spread this far and wide. I feel my sister saying, keep talking about this. And without further me, all of you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. You took the words right out my mouth in regards to this conversation. So I'm so happy that you're all here with us to continue this conversation, which we hope is an ongoing conversation. And so we've just seen a film where Sarah and her many characters take the audience on this journey exploring two differing perspectives of the sex trade. So one, Bella, characterizes the sex trade as sexually empowering and advocates for the full decriminalization of the sex trade. So this includes pimping, includes sex buying, includes the brothel keeping and the sale of sexual acts. And then we've got the other perspective, Nerida's, where she asserts the sex trade is characterized by sexual exploitation. It's derived from racism and colonialism. This side advocates for partial decriminalization, which is also known as the equality model. So this side, this means only decriminalizing those bought and sold in the sex trade. So New Yorkers for the Equality Model is a survivor-led alliance made up of 30 advocates, prostitution and sex trafficking survivors, and organizational partners seeking to implement the Equality Model in New York State. And on behalf of New Yorkers for the Equality Model, I did want to just extend a big thank you to Sarah for creating this movie that sheds light on this issue and often isn't explored. So we're really thankful for that and for coming out onto the side of the Equality Model. So if we could give a round of applause to Sarah.
And I'll just say, if anybody posts anything on Instagram about me being pro Equality Model, I'm gonna catch it. So as painful as this is to say, I guess what I want to say is I hope to take this film to the point where people are making their own. I don't want to be seen as someone who's prescriptive, and I want to be clear that I have relationships with people who would say all of us in this room are wrong. And my goal is to keep having conversations like this, especially for the vast majority of the people who have no idea about any of this. They are coming at this with no opinion on one side or the other, and that's where I think there's an opportunity to have a new conversation that, again, isn't about vitriol, but is instead about letting people arrive at their own clarity. So just wanted to say that.
Absolutely, thank you, Sarah. And so I know that we've all just sat through an entire film, so we are keeping this panel discussion brief at 30 minutes. I have 6 questions, and let's begin. So before I wanted to dive into specific scenes from the film, my first question, I wanted to touch upon the importance of language and how it's often overlooked, but it plays such a key role in shaping the narrative of this issue. And so my first question is for Melanie, if I can please. Throughout the film, we see different terms being used, such as sex work, sex worker, sex trade, and survivor. And we even see at one point Sarah's character herself shows confusion on which terminology to use. Could you comment on what language you use and why?
Sure. So, hi. I guess the first thing that I want to say is that these chairs are not made for everybody. So I keep switching, so forgive me. But so for me, I know this is something that comes up a lot, especially with language. We talk about what's the politically correct term to use, what's less offensive, things like that. So me personally, I do not use the term sex work or sex worker. In fact, I like to say that sex work is neither. It's not, sex is not work and work is not sex. And the reason for this, and I know there might be some raised eyebrows, right? A lot of people, especially in you know, I'm one of the younger folks on this panel, so oftentimes in the college setting, in the university setting, you'll see this a lot where people are like, no, we don't say prostitute, we say sex worker, or we don't say prostitution, we say it's sex work, right? And most of us kind of stick to that term because we think that it's the progressive route. That's the way to take, that's the way to be politically correct. The reason that I don't use the term sex worker is that a lot of people, or let me rephrase, a lot of people use the term sex work because they see prostitution as an individualized choice. So oftentimes when we think about those that engage in quote unquote sex work, what we're seeing is people saying, well, if somebody wants to make an OnlyFans, they should have the choice to do so, right? If somebody wants to be a stripper, they should be able to choose to do that. And it's all surface level, individualized choice. But when you get down to the nitty gritty of what prostitution actually looks like, you'll realize that it's actually a system that thrives on other oppressive systems, more namely patriarchy, misogyny, capitalism, colonialism, classism, and so on and so forth. Racism, absolutely. And when you actually see prostitution as a system that not only thrives on those systems I just named, but also is created to target folks for their vulnerabilities and their lack of resources, then you can actually realize that sex cannot be work and cannot be seen as a job like any other. For many other reasons, right? Look at it as a system and then you'll realize that it's actually not our choice, right? And for the majority of people that are actually in the sex trade, overwhelmingly, they're 95+% of them are Black and brown individuals, predominantly women, girls, and children. Of that 95%, well over 40% of them are folks that are in the LGBTQ plus community, predominantly trans individuals that are in the life, as I call it. And most of those people come from marginalized or impoverished backgrounds. So really, you know, when you talk to somebody one-on-one that may say, oh, well, I love sex work, or I'm a sex worker, usually we're like, okay, well, they made that choice, so we're just gonna use that term because they said that's what they wanna be called. And I'm not saying to disrespect that, right? But when you actually think about it and you look at it, you're like, well, what drove this person to say, I wanna be a stripper today, or I wanna make an OnlyFans? Usually when you get to the bottom of it, you find out that it's because of a lack of economic resource. They don't have a job. They might struggle with substance abuse, and in that moment they feel like they need prostitution to go ahead and fill this habit. They may have children. There's always, for the most part, majority of the time, there's always a lack of something, a lack of resource, some type of marginalization or vulnerability. And in that case, I like to say that your circumstance and your lack of choice becomes your pimp, becomes that point of exploitation. And that's the difference between an individualized choice and a choice that was made for you. And I always say that you cannot make a choice if you do not have choices. So if you are somebody that is privileged, that has all of your economic and daily needs met, and you live a basic sustainable life and you don't need that, then of course you can't say that sex work is work and that was your true choice because you're coming from something or a place of needing something. So that's why I don't use the term sex work, and I just stick with the sex trade. I don't use the terms prostitute. I say prostituted individual, which implies that the sex trade or something happened to you rather than you making that individualized choice for the reasons that I just mentioned.
Amazing, thank you, Melanie. And so my next question is for Esperanza. In the movie, Narita talks about the difference between partial decriminalization and full decriminalization at one point. Could you elaborate on the difference between those two bills and which one you support and why?
Yeah, so you know, and I guess maybe just real briefly, I wasn't able to fully introduce myself, but I also just want to say I'm a member of the organization AFFIRM, Association of Feminists Fighting Fascism, Imperialism, Marginalization, and Refeudalization. And so I also want to thank, you know, my sister Riham from our New York chapter for being here, and if you're in the area, you should check them out. But answering the question that was asked, you know, in the film, you might have heard me say that initially I was very pro full decriminalization because I really thought, you know, why are we criminalizing people who are, you know, doing what they need to do to survive? That's just incredibly irrational and stupid, right? But I didn't really understand what full decriminalization really meant. And it wasn't until I had experience in the sex trade, which was really horrible and traumatic, and I hope nobody here or any of your, you know, descendants have to go through that because it is extremely violent, as these women can tell you as well. Full decriminalization, which is often, you know, said it's not legalization, but it really is, right? Like when you look at full decriminalization bills throughout the US, like the one that was introduced in Oregon earlier this year, they're really legalization bills that, you know, allow the sex trade to be regulated, profited from, etc. My main objection to that is you cannot name a single point in history where expanding the legal rights of the people who are doing the exploiting helps the people that are being exploited, right? I don't believe the police are going to end rape or domestic violence, but I also don't think we should decriminalize rape or domestic violence. And in a very similar way, I don't believe the police are going to, you know, end sexual exploitation. But I do know that when you make sexual exploitation legal, when you remove any consequences from it, when you spread the lie that it's, you know, just a job like any other, then what you're doing is allowing that industry to expand rapidly. Whereas instead, I think that the only rational approach is to decriminalize people who are being exploited in the sex trade, whether you are a, you know, victim or survivor of trafficking, or whether you're in it by your so-called free choice. And unfortunately, you know, we're always told there's this difference between trafficking, which is bad, and sex work, which is good. And there really isn't a difference, right? Trafficking exists to meet the demand in prostitution because there's not enough willing participants. So many of us are either trafficked by force or pushed into it via coercion. And so, the equality model decriminalizes people exploited in the sex trade, but it does not remove prohibitions against pimping, sex buying, or brothel owning. And it also provides services for people who are in the sex trade and trying to exit, which is something Affirm works on because we don't have a right to exit. And I wish we had more time to talk about that because so many of us have had real horror stories, going homeless, being on the streets, not being able to exit. And that's why I believe that the sex trade is really one of the biggest institutions of rape culture because it traps people, mostly women, inside of it and forces them to have sex with men they don't want to have sex with day and day and day and day and day again. And then the very last thing I'm going to say in regards to policy is just that being in the United States, we also have to look at how our government promotes prostitution abroad. I'm thinking a lot about the trans woman Jennifer Lauda in the Philippines who was killed by a US Marine who was a sex buyer and strangled her and left her dead her head in a toilet. And it's a horrible story, but that happens everywhere. And so in addition to implementing the equality model here, we have to get US troops out of the Philippines. We have to shut down AFRICOM. There's no reason for all of these US troops to be in Africa pushing prostitution there. The US military is the very reason why the sex tourism industry in Thailand exists. We need to get the US military out of all of these other countries because we are one of the biggest promoters of prostitution worldwide, forcing women overseas into prostitution, but also forcing them to migrate and having them become trafficked over here into prostitution.
Thank you so much for that explanation. So I wanted to bring it to Sarah. So at the end of the film, you came out in support of the equality model, and I know you mentioned that you want everyone to go through this journey and make their own decision. And so I guess this is for people who are unsure of where they stand or they are still new to the issue. Could you tell us about the journey that you took to arrive at this decision, and was that journey easy?
I mean, it's, the journey is ongoing. I think what I'm learning time and again is logic, facts, reason are not necessarily where people go first, right? We're in a soundbite culture of Twitter wars and people sort of trying to be on the correct side. Everybody just wants to make sure they're not cancelable. And so what I discovered is my job is to not prescribe to anyone. And you'll notice there was a review in the New York Times. She says she doesn't come down on any side. And I'm fine with that. As the director of this film, if people come to it feeling like they have not been preached to, then I've done my job, right? For me, we have an opportunity. I've been talking about this for decades, like literally since I was a kid being solicited on the street myself. For the first time, I'm hoping there's a way to have the conversation that doesn't feel like two sides squared off against each other from these two silos with the mainstream in the middle totally clueless about any of it. So I guess what I'll say is my journey included talking to people who were like, what? What's decrypt? They have no idea. This is what they call insider baseball conversation, right? The level of expertise on this panel, most people have absolutely no idea. And so I tried to come at it on my journey from a place of like, wholesome family goes to a football game and then takes their kids to Hooters. Let's start to help people see that there's a continuum of a sex industry where your wings come with a side of the industry. And there's, kind of a problem of us stigmatizing, slut shaming, all of that is in there too. But I think for me, trying to have beginner's mind as much as possible and remind myself that every time I'm saying to people, like if people feel ignorant and like they are on the wrong side of something, they constrict even more. And so this is more like, hey, open mind, come and listen and go on the journey of, oh, I think it's this. I've had so many people, highly intelligent people, tell me that they were totally sure what they believed when they started watching the film, and then by the end had changed their mind. I didn't do that on purpose, but my goal is for people to take a journey and to feel my journey. And I'll just say, again, as the director of the film, on the record, I want people to make up their own minds.
Thank you for sharing that, Jenny, and for opening up the conversation, like you mentioned. So my next question is for Gigi. There was one scene where Evan, a pornographer, says his company pays millions of dollars to women who choose to be in the sex trade. Could you comment on the role of money in the sex trade?
I just want to check in with the audience. Obviously, you see me standing, and I'm standing because I'm holding my space. I'm holding my space because I'm out in the field and I'm in the trenches. And today, I helped 3 clients in crisis. So emotionally, I'm drained. I don't have the energy to get up on the chair, but I feel comfortable. So I'm also gonna read my answer because I'm drained. These are my thoughts, my experiences, and the clients that I work with daily. We're not judging anybody here. This is what I know. Millions of dollars are paid out by sex buyers. However, the people being bought are not taking home these millions. When you are new, you always make a lot of money in the beginning. It is the factor of which the buyer wants to be the first to buy you. It's the factor that they thrive on. He's willing often to pay more for the young and inexperienced. Once you pass the first 30 days, you are then a regular, and your value drops like a rock. In the sex trade, rather than leveling up with more experience, most women level down. Everyone gets shuffled around pornography, pole dancing, street prostitution, escort, and business parties. You quickly become worth less and less. This is the vivid truth. Anyone who's associated with this lifestyle has done all of it to desperately try to bring in more money, but it never stops, and the money is never enough. You are never taking in all the money you earn. The pimps take the majority, the fees are paid to the third party, like brothels, enforcers, like bodyguards, they take the cut. Expenses are high, anything from clothing to substance abuse. You can come home with less and less, which drives you to go deep into the dark and harmful places. And all of the costs of your self-worth and mental health. When you start coping with drugs or alcohol, your decisions making is even more impaired. You're pushed into more dangerous situations, more violent, unprotected sex, and more buyers at a night. You're thrown out of the nest and into the sea without a life vest. You earn from mistakes. You learn from your mistakes at the hands of the abusers. Painful pleasures of power and punishment from punters and pimps. Remember that. Yes, that one person you nearly came across who was willing to have a moment of kindness towards you is usually the one who's working on getting out. This is the person who will probably become the survivor, thriver, advocate later in life. Hello, ladies. There's no empowerment from being sold. Do you wish it for your child, your sibling, your friend? What do you think the results would be if we had an anonymous poll that asks everyone this question. My eyes, my ears, my mind knew I didn't belong in the sex trade. I saw that then, and I see it now. And 1% of the people that may seek this life, but everyone else is just trying to survive. To this day, from all the places and people that I have seen, the money does nothing for me. To those of you in the audience, the ones who are lost and confused and want help, I'm here for you. And the team I represent will be here to advocate for you too. We welcome you with open arms. Thank you.
Amazing. And so I wanted to circle back to Melanie. Sarah had a conversation with Bryan Cranston about sex buying. Other than this moment in the film, and in general, we don't hear much about sex buyers. And so I wanted to ask, why are sex buyers rarely discussed? Should they get a free pass? And is there such a thing as a good sex buyer?
This is a good question. So the first thing that comes to mind, right, when you ask why don't we talk about sex buyers enough, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the fact that people see prostitution, quote unquote, sex work as an individualized choice. And because we as a society have that mindset, what ends up happening is that we shift our focus from the person that has the resources to make this continue to the person that is being affected by the person with the resources. So we're all the time talking about what she's doing because they're predominantly women that are affected. We're talking about what is she doing, or what did she choose, or she said this, or she said that. And all the while we're having this debate about who is actually doing what we're leaving out of the conversation is these predominantly white, older men with disposable income that are purchasing little black and brown bodies like the three of us that don't have the same resources that they do, and that's just the reality. So oftentimes when we talk about prostitution, the first thing that comes to your head is not the dude, not the John, not the punter, not the sex buyer. You're thinking about me. And it may not be me because obviously I don't look like what probably pops in your head at the first sight of this conversation. But you're talking about me, you're talking about Gigi, you're talking about Esperanza. That's the first thing that comes in our minds. And because we have not shifted culturally as a society yet and how we think about prostitution, that's one of the reasons why sex buyers are not the first things that come to mind. But secondly, when we do have conversations like this and people are talking about sex buying, we don't focus on the demand enough because the harsh truth and reality is that the demand looks like your brother, your uncle, your father, your grandfather, your buddy, your colleague, the guy at work who just got engaged and wants to go to a bachelor party. Let's go hit the strip club. Let's have beers. It's these individuals. And then on top of that, it's judges, it's doctors, it's law enforcement, it's police officers. These are all people with privilege, higher positions of authority, abilities to abuse badges, right? These are the individuals that we're talking about. So the harsh reality is that we don't want to actually address the demand for a couple of reasons. We don't want to have to be forced to look in the mirror and be like, oh, this whole time it was happening right under my nose, right? There are people that when they hear prostitution and trafficking, they still think that it only happens in places like China or Russia, right? They think when we talk about, well, what do you know of the sex trade? What comes to mind for them is movies like Taken. Everybody seen Taken? Right? So like, granted that those things do happen, but especially in a big metro place like the US, like New York City, it looks like us, right? But a lot of times when we're talking about the demand and the role that demand plays, we don't want to face that harsh reality. We don't want to actually have to accept the fact that, oh, I've been having Christmas dinners with this person every year, right? We don't want to face the fact that, well, I know my brother was a little, he had weird behavior, but I don't really want to talk about that, right? It's uncomfortable. And I think part of the reason that we don't want to address the demand and their roles that they play in the sex trade is because it's uncomfortable. But the reality is, without the demand, there would be no supply. The sex trade would not exist if there weren't individuals that had extra cash, extra resources that just wanted to play on their power, right? And I want to emphasize that because a lot of people think that prostitution is about sex. It has nothing to do with sex. It has to do with power and control and being able to subvert and exploit somebody's lack of choice, resource, and subverting somebody's vulnerability and marginalization. There's a lot of times, and I think I can speak for all three of us up here, that we have had sex buyers that sometimes don't even want sex. A lot of the times, Johns just want to, a lot of the Johns, at least I can speak for myself, a lot of the Johns that I've had, if it's not sexual acts, it's them trying to get off on the fact that they can control you because you have less than, right? And let's get vivid for a second, because I don't think that some of you folks in this room are actually understanding the role that the sex buyers and Johns play in our lives. Right, I've had people purchase me at the age of 12 and 13 and told me that for an hour I needed to crawl and bark like a dog. That has nothing to do with sex. That has to do with the fact that you can control me because you have something that I don't and that I need to live sustainably. When we talk about the sex trade and we talk about, oh, well, it's sex work is work and this, that, and the third, what we're not taking into account is that we are not at the center of our own jobs development. This is not gainful employment. We cannot be promoted. We can't gain up. There are no benefits to this job. Like Gigi just mentioned, the money that goes into the sex trade, we don't see it, right? We're not the ones that are collecting this money. And I know that is on contrast and on the contrary to popular belief, but we don't see that money. The money might come through us, the money might come in us, but we don't get it, right? It goes back into the people with the positions of authority, those with more privilege, and those that have the power and control to exploit us because we're vulnerable and marginalized. So I really want folks to start, if you leave with nothing else from this room today, I want you to really take into account that the sex trade, prostitution is not about sex. It's about power and control of those who do not have any power or control. And I want you to understand that sex buyers play a very big role in our exploitation. It's not just the pimps, it's not just us making a choice. It's about individuals who say, you need $100 to eat, you don't have it, but I do, what are you gonna do for it? Right, that's power and control, that's not sex. I don't know if I had answered if there's such thing as a good sex buyer, but I hope in that you kind of got where I'm going with that.
I think we got
Yeah.
the message, and I'm really thankful for you to shed light on this issue that doesn't get talked about enough. So thank you, Melanie. And so we're on to our last question. Our last question is for Esperanza. In the film, prior to your scene, which was, you did phenomenal, we see a scene with Alice Little. And she's painting brothels as fun, exciting, and safe. Do you think prostitution can be made safe for people who are being brought?
Yeah, so before I explain why it can never be made safe, my answer is of course no. I also want to share something with you that I learned post-production of this film that was actually pretty horrifying to me about that brothel. And namely, it's that, the way that the doctor's office is portrayed is about accessibility to healthcare. Like, we bring the doctor to us. Well, what you might not know is that when the women check into the brothel, you have to line up, you have to get a pap smear, right? The doctor has to check you inside and out. And after you're examined by the physician, you're on lockdown. You're not allowed to leave the brothel for several days, for the weekend, the week, however long your shift is. That's not okay, right? Like, you imagine being locked down in a brothel, right? And so I think that what we really have to do is separate industry propaganda from reality. What is reality? Where did the sex trade start? It started with enslaved women and children. On this continent, the first history we have about the sex trade are from Christopher Columbus's journals about there being a market for 12 and 13-year-old girls. Throughout all of history, the sex trade has never changed its core character, which is that it has always been violent for those of us who find ourselves trapped within it. When you look even at countries, and I mentioned this in the film, and this is based on data that you could look at, right? Everyone says, oh, if you decriminalize pimps and sex buyers and brothel owners, then you'll destigmatize people in the sex trade. Well, that's false, because there was a long-term study in New Zealand, which is hailed as the model of decriminalization, and stigma against women in the sex trade, particularly lower income or poor women in the sex trade, did not decrease at all. The way they were talked about, the way they were thought about in society was the same. So stigma didn't change. And then you look at violence, the homicide rates against women in the sex trade in countries where it's either legalized or decriminalized doesn't change either. Women are still getting murdered in the sex trade, but they tell you, oh, it's because you still have work to do. Well, the work to do is not to expand the rights of the people killing us, the sex buyers, it's to end and abolish the sex trade, sexual exploitation. So no, the sex trade can never be made safe for us, because like Melanie was saying, it's about power. I mean, you should ask yourself, would you go right now and find someone off the streets who you know needs a housing, needs food, needs to put a roof over their head, they're really in a bad situation, and would you go and use their pain and their struggle to get off, to use their body? Like, would you do that? And if your answer is no, then ask yourself, well, what kind of person would? And the kind of person that could dehumanize you, because you're not seen as a human being if you're seen as a commodity, right? Like when you are, that's the whole point of being commodified. When we talk about commodification, it means dehumanization, because you're transformed from a human being with, full rights and autonomy, you're transformed into a commodity that could be traded or used for profit, or that could be bought and used for pleasure. And someone who sees you as a commodity does not see you as a human being. And what they are capable of doing to you is a lot of horrible things. And I'm not going to recount everything, but I think you know. And then also I just want to say the things that come along with the life. So we talk about drug addiction, right? When you have to, a lot of us have mental trauma because of how many times you have to dissociate from your body in order to allow these men to do what they want to do, to enact their fantasies on you. You often have to abuse drugs and alcohol and other substances, and that also leads to violence. And so in the film I talk about, I had 4 friends die in the sex trade, I had 2 more friends die after the film. It's not a safe place for anyone, and that's part of the reason why, we just had dinner and we were talking about how some of these college feminist gender studies professor, I hate calling them feminists, they're grooming young girls, young trans people, they're grooming them into believing that the sex trade is just like any other job, like it's empowering. And what's going to happen is these young girls are going to grow up, they're going to enter prostitution, they're going to get raped, they're going to get beaten, they're going to get robbed, and they're going to live with a lifetime of trauma because this society, their professors, the media, told them that this is a life that is glamorous and where you'll make money and you'll feel empowered or you'll feel like a bad bitch, and it's really the exact opposite.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to all my panelists for sharing their experiences. Could we give another round of applause?